The woman's hands trembled as she ground the barley between two stones, the gritty sound filling the single room where 7 people slept. Dawn had not yet broken, but she had been awake for an hour, knowing that today's bread depended on arms that ached from yesterday's labor. The smell of smoke from damp wood stung her eyes as she worked, and through the doorway she could see frost on the olive trees, frost that meant the harvest had come too late again. What does it actually mean when the Gospels say that Jesus came from a poor family? For centuries, we have imagined poverty in the ancient world through the lens of our modern experience, perhaps picturing someone without a bank account or living in a small apartment. But the reality of being poor in first-century Galilee was far from our contemporary understanding. It was not simply about having less money, but about living on the edge of survival every single day. 2,000 years ago, poverty meant waking before sunrise to grind grain by hand, walking miles to find work that might not exist, rationing food so children could eat while parents went hungry, and knowing that a single illness or failed harvest could mean the difference between life and death. When we read that Jesus grew up in Nazareth, a village of perhaps 200 people, what were the actual conditions of his daily existence? What did his family eat? How did they obtain it? And what happened when they could not? For centuries, we have imagined the Holy Family in softly lit scenes, with clean robes and peaceful expressions. But the historical reality reveals something far more raw and immediate. This was a world where the majority of people lived in one-room stone houses with dirt floors, where animals slept inside during winter for warmth, where the smell of sweat and smoke and dung was constant and inescapable, where hands were perpetually calloused from stone and wood and rope, where hunger was not occasional but seasonal and predictable, where women spent 4 hours daily just grinding grain for bread, where children worked alongside adults from age 7 or 8, where debt could lead to selling your own family members, where illness meant begging. Understanding what poverty actually meant in this time and place is not merely an academic exercise. It transforms how we read Jesus' parables about laborers waiting for work, about women searching for lost coins, about fathers dividing inadequate inheritances. These were not hypothetical illustrations, but descriptions of the world he lived in and observed daily. When Jesus spoke about the poor, he was not romanticizing from a distance. He was describing his neighbors, his family, and quite possibly himself. Many details of the Gospels gain new and deeper meaning when we understand the material conditions that shaped every moment of daily existence in first-century Galilee. Stay until the end, because what you are about to discover goes beyond historical curiosity and can strengthen our faith today. But this poverty was not abstract. It was built into the very walls where Jesus lived. The typical poor family's house in Galilee was a single rectangular room, roughly 15 feet by 20 feet, constructed from local fieldstone, stacked without mortar and chinked with mud. The walls were thick but crude, letting in wind through countless gaps. The floor was packed earth, smooth from years of feet and moisture, cool and slightly damp even in summer. During winter rains, it could become slick with mud tracked in from outside. The roof consisted of wooden beams overlaid with branches, covered with a thick mat of clay and straw that had to be repacked each autumn. When it rained hard, water dripped through in streams, and families positioned clay vessels to catch it, the same vessels used for everything else. Inside this space, everything happened. 7 to 10 people slept on woven reed mats, rolled out each night on raised stone platforms along the walls. Cooking occurred over a small fire pit, the smoke theoretically escaping through the door since there was no chimney, but in reality filling the room and blackening the walls and ceiling with soot. The smell was overwhelming. Smoke mixed with the acrid tang of animal waste, since the family's donkey or goats slept in a lower section of the same room during cold months. Their body heat was not luxury, but necessity. During summer, the animals stayed outside, but the smell remained embedded in the earthen floor. There was no privacy, no personal space, no separate areas for different activities. When someone was sick, everyone was exposed. When parents had marital relations, children learned to sleep through sounds. When a woman gave birth, it happened here, in this same room where bread was baked and grain was stored and tools were mended. The center of this domestic existence was bread. Not bread as we know it, soft, white, enriched, but dense, dark, flat rounds of barley that provided perhaps 70% of all calories consumed. Making this bread was not a quick task, but a daily ordeal that consumed enormous labor. Women rose before dawn to grind grain using a saddle quern, a large flat stone with a smaller stone rolled back and forth across it. This grinding produced a coarse flour mixed with tiny stone particles that wore down teeth progressively throughout life. Archaeological examination of skeletal remains from this period shows severe dental abrasion even in young adults, a direct physical consequence of poverty. Wheat was for the wealthy, barley was for survival. The bread Jesus ate was coarse, gritty, heavy, and often partially stale because fuel for baking was scarce. This daily grinding was not a choice, but survival. If you did not grind, your family did not eat. If you became too sick to grind, your children went hungry unless neighbors helped, and neighbors were themselves barely surviving. The quern stones represented significant investment, sometimes passed down through generations. Losing them to debt or theft was catastrophic. This is why Mosaic law specifically prohibited taking millstones as collateral for loans. It meant taking someone's ability to sustain life itself. The weight of the upper stone, the repetitive motion, hour after hour, the strain on wrists and shoulders and back, these were the physical lessons of poverty. Jesus learned what it meant when his mother's hands ached, when the grain ran low before harvest, when yesterday's bread had to stretch to feed unexpected guests. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body, about scarcity, about the anxiety of tomorrow's provision, about the physical cost of survival. Later, when Jesus spoke about daily bread, he was not creating metaphors. He was describing the bread his family ground and baked every single morning, the bread that required hours of painful labor before a single bite could be taken. This reveals something fundamental about the incarnation. God entered not simply human nature, but human poverty, with all its physical weight and weariness. When we move beyond the physical house, we discover that poverty in Galilee was organized through brutal economic structures that trapped families across generations. The social world Jesus grew up in was not simply divided between rich and poor, but structured through layers of debt, taxation, and land loss that created a permanent underclass with virtually no possibility of upward mobility. Understanding this system changes how we read nearly every parable about masters and servants, landowners and laborers, creditors and debtors. The fundamental reality was land ownership. In first-century Galilee, perhaps 5% of the population controlled most of the arable land, while the vast majority either worked as tenant farmers on others' land or owned tiny plots barely sufficient for survival. Jesus' family almost certainly fell into this latter category, small landholders or craftspeople who existed in constant precarious balance. A tekton, the word used to describe both Joseph and Jesus, was not a skilled carpenter in our sense, but a day laborer who worked with stone and wood, often in construction projects. This meant inconsistent work, irregular income, and frequent periods without employment. Archaeological evidence from Sepphoris, a major building project just 4 miles from Nazareth during Jesus' youth, suggests that local laborers walked daily to find work there, competing for jobs that might last a day or a week or a season. But poverty in this world was not static. It had momentum, always pulling downward. The Roman taxation system, combined with temple tithes, meant that peasant families owed between 30 and 40% of their produce annually in various taxes and religious obligations. When a harvest failed due to drought or locust, families could not simply pay less. The obligations remained fixed. This forced borrowing, and debt in the ancient world was not like modern debt. Interest rates were astronomical, often 50% or more annually. Collateral began with surplus goods, then tools, then land itself, then finally family members who could be sold into debt slavery to satisfy creditors. This was not theoretical, but common. Debt was the mechanism that systematically transferred land from poor farmers to wealthy landowners, consolidating economic power while creating a growing class of landless poor. The Gospel accounts mention tax collectors repeatedly, always with negative connotation, and this reflects actual lived experience. These were not government bureaucrats, but private contractors who paid Rome a fixed amount for the right to collect taxes in a region, then extracted whatever they could from the population, keeping the surplus as profit. The system incentivized exploitation and was deeply resented, yet refusal meant violence. Roman soldiers enforced collection. Families caught between impossible obligations learned the bitter taste of powerlessness. You worked, you produced, and then others took the fruit of your labor through mechanisms you had no power to resist or change. For the poor, work itself was degrading and uncertain. The parable of laborers standing in the marketplace waiting to be hired was not imagination, but observation. This happened daily in every town. Men gathered at dawn, hoping a landowner would need extra hands for harvest or construction. Those chosen worked for a denarius, barely enough to feed a family for a day. Those not chosen went home with nothing, facing hungry children and accumulating debt. The anxiety was crushing. Tomorrow might bring work, or it might not. Next month might bring harvest employment, or drought might mean no work at all. This uncertainty was the texture of poverty. Not knowing, never being secure, always vulnerable. Jesus learned this vulnerability firsthand. He grew up in a community where neighbors lost their land, where families divided inadequate inheritances among too many sons, where young women married because it was economic necessity rather than romantic choice. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body, about injustice, about the grinding anxiety of debt, about the powerlessness of watching family members suffer while wealthy landowners accumulated more. Later, when Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God belonging to the poor, he was not creating comfortable metaphors. He was describing the actual poor of Galilee, the landless and indebted and desperate, and proclaiming their unexpected inheritance. This detail profoundly alters how we understand the revolutionary nature of his message. After understanding the economic trap of poverty, we must confront its temporal dimension, how the poor experience time itself differently than the wealthy. For modern people, time is measured in hours and appointments, in schedules and deadlines. But for the poor in first-century Galilee, time was measured by the rhythms of hunger and harvest, by seasons of scarcity and brief moments of sufficiency. This was not abstract philosophical difference, but bodily reality that shaped every day and every decision. The agricultural calendar dictated everything. The barley harvest came in late March or early April, followed by wheat in May. These were brief windows of relative abundance, not wealth, but enough. Families ate fully during harvest season, even enjoying foods beyond bread. Fresh vegetables, perhaps some fruit, occasionally fish if someone had coin to purchase it. But this plenty was temporary, and everyone knew it. By late summer, stored grain began to run low. By winter, many families faced what scholars call the hungry season, the months between when last year's grain was exhausted and this year's crop was not yet ready. During these months, the poor ate less, rationed carefully, and watched their children's ribs become more visible through skin. This seasonal hunger was predictable, but inescapable. Unlike the wealthy who could store grain in large quantities or purchase food year-round, the poor lived perpetually close to the edge. A single bad harvest meant immediate crisis. 2 consecutive bad harvests meant catastrophe, selling tools, selling land, selling family members into slavery. The anxiety was constant. Would the rains come? Would they come too early, rotting the grain? Would they come too late, leaving fields withered? Would locusts swarm? Would Roman tax collectors demand more than could be paid? Every season brought uncertainty, and the poor had no cushion, no savings, no safety net to absorb disaster. The daily rhythm followed this same pattern of scarcity and waiting. Each morning, families assessed what remained. How much grain was left? How much bread could be made? Would it be enough for everyone? Children learned early not to ask for more, learned to ignore the grinding sensation of hunger, learned that enough meant something very different than fullness. Men left before dawn seeking work, not knowing if they would return with wages or empty-handed. Women managed scarcity with extraordinary skill, stretching resources, negotiating trades with neighbors, making impossible decisions about who ate what. The wealthy could plan weeks or months ahead, but the poor lived hour to hour, day to day, harvest to harvest. This temporal experience shaped perception and values profoundly. The future was not a space of possibility, but of threat. Tomorrow might bring disaster. Next month might bring starvation. Planning was futile when a single misfortune could destroy everything. Instead, the poor developed what researchers call present orientation, a focus on immediate survival because long-term planning was luxury they could not afford. This was not moral failure or lack of character, but rational adaptation to real conditions. When you are hungry today, tomorrow's abstractions matter less. When your child is sick now, future consequences become secondary. Yet paradoxically, the poor also developed extraordinary patience and endurance. They waited for harvest, for work, for rain, for relief. They endured through hunger, through cold, through loss, through grief. This waiting was not passive, but active, a kind of stubborn persistence in the face of systems designed to crush them. Nothing seemed extraordinary in this waiting. Yet something essential was being built, a capacity to endure, a refusal to despair, a hope that persisted despite evidence. Jesus learned this rhythm of scarcity and waiting. He grew up watching his mother ration food, watching his father search for work, watching neighbors lose land to debt, while waiting seasons for justice that never came. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body, about anxiety for tomorrow, about trusting for daily provision, about the difference between needs and wants. Later, when Jesus taught his disciples to pray for daily bread, he was not creating spiritual metaphors. He was describing the actual prayer of the poor, who genuinely did not know where tomorrow's food would come from, who needed bread today because tomorrow was uncertain and terrifying. And it is precisely this that begins to reveal why the Gospels emphasize present-tense provision rather than accumulated wealth. Beyond the material deprivations and temporal anxieties, poverty shaped something deeper in those who experienced it, a particular way of seeing the world and understanding human need. The spiritual formation that occurred through poverty was not romantic or comfortable, but it created a perspective that the wealthy simply could not access. Jesus' entire ministry bears the marks of this formation, revealing a God whose concern flows first toward those whom society has marginalized and dismissed. Growing up poor meant learning certain truths in the bones. You learned that your worth as a person was not reflected in how society treated you. You learned that the wealthy were not wealthy because of superior virtue, nor were the poor poor because of moral failure. The system itself created and maintained these divisions. You learned to recognize the small acts of kindness that made survival possible. The neighbor who shared grain during hungry months, the relative who offered work when none existed, the midwife who attended births without payment because everyone understood that community survival depended on mutual support. These acts were not charity from above, but solidarity among those who shared common vulnerability. Jesus learned this solidarity through direct experience. He knew what it meant when a woman swept her house searching desperately for a lost coin, because that coin represented days of food. He knew the relief when laborers were hired at the last hour, because he had watched men return home empty-handed to hungry families. He knew the shame of debt, the anxiety of obligation, the humiliation of begging. This knowledge was not intellectual but bodily, embedded in memory, in sensation, in the residue of actual experience. When he later touched lepers, ate with tax collectors, welcomed prostitutes and sinners, these were not calculated political gestures, but expressions of a compassion formed through shared marginalization. The poor also learned something about dependence and trust that shaped spiritual consciousness. When you have no resources to fall back on, when tomorrow's provision is genuinely uncertain, you discover whether you can trust beyond yourself. Some became bitter and hard, which was understandable given the brutality of their circumstances. But others developed a kind of radical dependence, not passive resignation, but active trust that provision would somehow come, that life would somehow continue. This was not naive optimism, but survival wisdom. Despair was luxury the poor could not afford. They had to keep grinding grain, keep seeking work, keep putting one foot forward, even when logic suggested futility. This formation through poverty created the lens through which Jesus viewed the kingdom of God. His parables consistently elevated the poor, the indebted, the marginalized, not because poverty itself is virtuous, but because those who have experienced powerlessness understand grace in ways the powerful cannot. The wealthy could imagine they earned their status, deserved their comfort, controlled their destiny. The poor had no such illusions. They knew they were dependent, vulnerable, unable to save themselves. This knowledge created openness, an awareness of need that made divine provision recognizable when it came. Jesus learned that God's concern flows toward those the world dismisses. He observed how religious leaders passed by beggars without seeing them, how the wealthy insulated themselves from poverty's reality, how systems ground down human dignity while claiming divine sanction. These experiences were not abstract. They were lessons learned in the body, about whose lives matter, about where God's attention focuses, about the reversal coming when the last become first. Later, when Jesus proclaimed good news to the poor, he was not creating theological abstractions. He was announcing the kingdom to those who actually needed it, to those whose desperation made them ready to receive what the self-sufficient would reject. This reveals something fundamental about incarnation and identification. God did not enter human experience through privilege and power, observing poverty from comfortable distance. God entered through poverty itself, experiencing vulnerability and dependence and marginalization from the inside. This was not accidental, but essential. Only from this position could divine compassion be authentic, could solidarity be real, could the proclamation of reversal carry genuine authority. The method has not changed. God still acts through the weak to shame the strong, through the poor to judge the wealthy, through the powerless to overturn empires. To conclude, reflect on what we have uncovered. When we observe what poverty actually meant in first-century Galilee, we realize that it was far more than economic category. It was total life condition that shaped every aspect of existence. The one-room stone house with dirt floors and smoke-blackened walls, the daily grinding of coarse barley that wore down teeth and exhausted bodies, the brutal system of debt and taxation that trapped families across generations with no escape, the seasonal rhythm of hunger and waiting that made tomorrow genuinely uncertain and terrifying, and the spiritual formation through vulnerability that created capacity for radical trust and authentic compassion. Each of these elements was not separate but interconnected, forming the complete texture of what it meant to be poor when Jesus walked the dusty roads of Galilee. Jesus knew these realities intimately. He knew the ache in arms from grinding grain before dawn, the anxiety of watching stored food run low before harvest, the humiliation of debt collectors, the desperate hope of laborers waiting in the marketplace, the gnawing sensation of hunger that children learned to ignore, the uncertainty that made each day a question rather than a certainty. And it was on this common ground of actual poverty, not romanticized or spiritualized, but bodily and immediate and harsh, that the good news was prepared. The kingdom of God was not announced from palaces to comfortable audiences, but from hillsides to the hungry, from fishing boats to the indebted, from village streets to the desperate. Understanding this daily life changes the way we read the Gospels. Suddenly, the parables are not quaint rural illustrations, but precise descriptions of real situations Jesus observed and experienced. The Beatitudes are not spiritual metaphors, but literal proclamation to people who were actually poor, actually mourning, actually hungry. The Lord's Prayer is not timeless poetry, but the urgent petition of people who genuinely needed daily bread and forgiveness of debts. This historical reality carries eternal principle. God acts in the invisible, in the simple, in what seems small. The method has not changed. The divine presence still manifests not primarily through wealth and power and influence, but through vulnerability and poverty and marginalization. God still identifies with those whom systems crush, still hears the cry of the oppressed, still promises reversal when the mighty are brought low and the humble exalted. This calls us to reflection about where we locate ourselves in this narrative. Do we identify with the wealthy landowners hoarding grain, or with the poor laborers waiting for work? Do we see poverty as failure to be corrected through individual effort, or as systemic injustice requiring structural change? Do we spiritualize Jesus' identification with the poor into comfortable abstraction, or do we allow it to challenge our own relationship to wealth and poverty, to power and vulnerability, to security and dependence? The incarnation means that God has experienced poverty from the inside, not as observer or helper from above, but as participant in the struggle for survival. This should fundamentally alter how we view both God and the poor. God is not distant from material need, but intimately acquainted with it. The poor are not objects of charity, but bearers of wisdom about dependence and trust that the self-sufficient cannot access. And we are invited not simply to study this history, but to allow it to transform our understanding of where God is found and how the kingdom operates even now. And if this documentary strengthened your faith and expanded your understanding of what Jesus actually experienced in first century Galilee, leave your like, comment on what you found most interesting, and share this video. Your support helps carry this story forward. Until the next video, may we remember that the God who chose poverty as the entry point into human life continues to be found among those our world dismisses and overlooks.